where curiosity settles in, the lights stay low, and science is allowed to unfold at a gentler pace. Tonight, we are heading into very old water, the kind that covered parts of Britain long before fields, roads, hedgerows, and seaside car parks. We're going back to a time when the land we know as Somerset sat beside a restless Triassic sea, and something enormous moved through it. Not large in the casual way we talk about a crocodile or a shark. Not even large in the way we talk about the biggest animals most of us can picture without help. I mean the sort of large that forces the brain to stop for a second and do some reluctant arithmetic. A body perhaps around 25 metres long, a marine reptile known from giant jaw bones, a creature now called Ichthyotitan sevenensis, identified from fossils found on the Somerset coast and described in 2024 as probably the largest marine reptile formerly named so far. That estimate puts it in the same length class as a modern blue whale, which is not a sentence one writes lightly. It is the kind of fact that makes a beach feel less like a pleasant place for a walk and more like the edge of a filing cabinet full of unfinished business from prehistory. Before we get into jawbones, ancient shorelines, and the awkward business of trying to estimate the size of an animal from fragments that look, to most of us, like weathered stone with ambition, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there right now? It feels appropriate somehow. A story about an ocean giant from roughly 202 million years ago, told to people scattered across different clocks, different rooms, different late-night routines. Some of you may be hearing this under a blanket with one lamp still on. Some may be listening half awake, fully intending to stay alert and absorb every detail, right up until the exact moment your brain decides it has other plans. Some of you may be at the very end of a long day, looking for something interesting enough to hold the mind, but calm enough not to start an argument with sleep. If that is the case, you are in the right place. And if you find this quiet trip into ancient seas soothing, strange, or just a pleasant way to wind down, do give the video a like, maybe subscribe, and share this little corner of slow science with someone else who might enjoy hearing about a reptile so large it makes the phrase marine reptile sound almost inadequate. Now, there is something especially satisfying about the way this story begins, not with a complete skeleton lifted from rock in a dramatic excavation, not with a skull in perfect condition, obligingly placed where scientists might find it, and certainly not with a giant shadow rolling up beneath a ship, which would have improved the mood for us but done very little for the evidence. No, this story begins with pieces of jaw on a beach in Somerset. In 2020 at Blue Anchor, Justin and Ruby Reynolds found parts of a huge fossil jawbone while out fossil hunting, and Ruby was only 11 at the time. The bone fragments were not just large, they were the sort of large that quickly stops looking normal and starts demanding comparison with something else. When the pieces were studied, paleontologist Dean Lomax recognised that they matched the general kind of structure seen in another giant jaw fragment found earlier in Somerset near Lilstock in 2016 by fossil collector Paul de la Salle. Those two discoveries, from the same region and roughly the same slice of geological time, turned out to belong to the same new species. That matters because one strange bone can be a puzzle. Two matching giant bones from nearby localities start to look a lot more like a pattern, and patterns are where science begins to get comfortable enough to make careful, serious claims. The specific bone in question is called a surangula, part of the lower jaw. It is not the sort of word people usually bring up over tea unless they are either paleontologists or have made a wrong turn in conversation and decided to commit to it. But here it becomes very important. The Blue Anchor surangula was more complete and better preserved than the earlier Lilstock specimen. Researchers concluded that the more complete jawbone would have been over 2 meters long by itself, and from comparisons with other giant ichthyosaurs, they estimated the whole animal at about 25 meters in length. The paper also notes that body length estimates based on related giant jaw material have ranged from roughly 22 meters to more than 30, which tells you two things at once. First, this was an absurdly large animal. Second, there is still uncertainty, because ancient giants rarely leave behind the courtesy of a full measuring tape. The new species name, Ichthyotitan sevenensis, means giant fish lizard of the seven, which is a very direct bit of naming, and in fairness, once an extinct marine reptile is flirting with blue whale scale, subtlety becomes unnecessary. That blue whale comparison deserves a moment, because it is easy to hear it and let it pass by, without properly allowing it to inconvenience the imagination. Blue whales are the modern standard for size in the sea. They are what we reach for whenever we want to explain largeness with dignity. Entire school trips can be silenced, briefly, by standing under the suspended skeleton of one in a museum and realizing that the animal overhead was not an exaggeration or a legend or a sailor's poor judgment. It was real, and it swam. So when researchers say this Triassic reptile may have reached around the same length as a blue whale, that does not mean it looked like a blue whale, lived like one, or weighed the same. Length is not the whole story. Build matters, ecology matters, soft tissue matters, and Ichthyotitan is still known from jaw material, not a complete body. But length alone is enough to make the point. Ancient oceans were not simply populated by creatures that were smaller, rougher drafts of later marine giants. At least sometimes, evolution was willing to go very big, very early, and in forms that have no modern direct equivalent. By the late Triassic, giant ichthyosaurs had already become some of the most spectacular vertebrates on Earth, and this Somerset animal may represent the largest marine reptile formerly described. It is also worth clearing away one common mental image before it hardens into certainty. When people hear about a reptile the size of a whale, the mind often rushes straight to super predator, as though anything large in the sea must have spent its days behaving like a nightmare with the teeth. But the actual picture here is not settled so neatly. The authors of the 2024 paper suggest Shastasaurid affinities for Ichthyotitan based on its age and giant size, though they're careful to say the remains are too incomplete for a definitive placement. Shastasaurid ichthyosaurs are a late Triassic group that included other giants such as Shonisaurus. Some members of that broader giant ichthyosaur world may have had feeding styles quite unlike the usual simple image of a giant reptile chasing everything in sight. In other words, enormous does not automatically mean built like a marine tyrant lizard. It means enormous. It means ecologically important. It means physically extreme. It means that in those ancient seas there existed animals so large that the usual rules of scale begin to shift around them. That uncertainty, oddly enough, makes the animal more interesting, not less. A giant with missing pieces is more unsettling than a giant fully explained. It leaves a room for the bones to keep arguing with us. And these were not latecomers to marine gigantism. Ichthyosaurs, as a group, appeared in the Triassic around 250 million years ago, and they achieved large size with impressive speed. The PLOS paper notes that forms reaching roughly 15 to 17 metres had already evolved only a few million years after the group first appears in the fossil record. That is one of the striking things about life after mass extinctions. Once ecosystems are damaged and rebuilt, evolution sometimes starts experimenting like a person rearranging furniture with far too much confidence. The early Mesozoic seas were not waiting around politely for whales to invent the big body plan. Marine reptiles got there first. By the late Triassic, giant ichthyosaurs had spread across parts of Asia, Europe and North America. Ichthyotitan appears to have been among the last of those giants, living in the latest Triassic, in the Rhaetian stage, around 202 million years ago. The fossil horizon immediately above the level of the Somerset finds is associated in the paper with evidence of catastrophe linked to the end-Triassic mass extinction event. So this animal stands not just as a measure of how large marine reptiles could become, but also as one of the final huge signatures written just before a major ecological reset. There is another detail in this story that I like very much, because it makes the whole thing bigger in a slightly irritating way. The blue anchor specimen showed bone structure suggesting that the individual was still growing. That means the already shocking estimate may not represent a fully grown giant. It is one thing to be told a reptile may have reached around 25 metres. It is another to be told, quite calmly, that the particular individual in the better preserved specimen may not even have been done yet. This is the point where the mind starts trying to save itself with skepticism, which is healthy and appropriate, and conveniently built into the research itself. Scientists are not claiming they have a full skeleton proving every measurement beyond doubt. They are saying the bone is real, the comparisons are serious, the morphology is distinctive, and the evidence supports a huge animal, perhaps larger than previously appreciated. That is the responsible version. The irresponsible version, usually produced somewhere around midnight by the rest of us, is to picture an animal already matching a blue whale in length, while still technically being a work in progress. Nature, on occasion, appears to have taken the phrase "room to grow" much too literally. If you imagine the Somerset coast today, with its cliffs, mudstones, beach walks, weather, and the ordinary business of people stooping to inspect interesting-looking rocks, it can be difficult to reconcile that scene with the world these bones came from. Yet that is one of the pleasures of paleontology. A coastline can be both mundane and ridiculous at the same time. Children can look for fossils where a 200-million-year-old jawbone waits to be noticed. A patch of England can once have been seafloor. A place where someone now unwraps a sandwich in a windbreaker can once have hosted water deep enough for an animal the length of a blue whale to pass through it. The Blue Anchor and Lilstock finds came from the Westbury Mudstone Formation, part of the uppermost Triassic record in that area. These rocks are not merely stone, they are storage. They keep a coastline's older job on file. They remember when Somerset was part of a marine setting close to the end of the Triassic, and when giant ichthyosaurs still occupied those seas. One of the things I enjoy most about this kind of discovery is that it does not ask us to go somewhere exotic to feel wonder. It asks us to look harder at places that already exist, and accept that the ground beneath them has had more careers than we have. There is also a quiet human side to this that deserves to stay in the frame. Science, especially when it deals with giant extinct animals, often arrives in the public imagination looking polished and complete, as though knowledge descends from a high shelf already labelled. But this case involved local fossil hunters, a family find on a beach, comparisoned with an earlier specimen, years of work, and then the cautious naming of a species. Justin Reynolds, Ruby Reynolds, and Paul de la Salle were included as co-authors on the paper. I like that. It reminds us that the story of prehistory is not uncovered only by people in lab coats stepping dramatically out of helicopters. Very often it begins with attention. Somebody notices that a piece of bone is not just a piece of bone. Somebody keeps it. Somebody asks the right person. Somebody compares it to something found years before. Eventually an animal with a name emerges from a coastline that had been holding its jaw in pieces. That process is slower than the version in films, but much more convincing. It also suits the subject. A marine giant from the edge of the Triassic should not enter the world all at once. It should arrive the way it did here, by degrees, as if even now the sea were reluctant to give the whole thing back. So this is where we are as we settle into the story. We have a giant lower jaw from Blue Anchor, another from nearby Lilstock, a newly named species, a length estimate around 25 metres, evidence that the better-known individual was still growing, and a creature living near the end of the Triassic, just before a mass extinction that would strip away these colossal forms and ensure that ichthyosaurs never again reach such sizes. What we do not have is a complete skeleton, an easy answer to every ecological question, or the comfort of a tidy ending. Instead, we have something better for our purposes tonight. We have the edge of a very large fact. We have enough bone to know that ancient seas were capable of producing animals at a scale that still makes modern people blink. We have enough context to see that gigantism can appear, flourish, and vanish. And we have enough uncertainty left over to keep the subject alive in the mind, which is useful, because the next thing worth doing is stepping away from the name for a moment and moving closer to the shore itself, to the beach in Somerset, to the shape of the rock, to the moment a child and her father noticed that one broken piece of the ancient world was not done speaking. So let us move in a little closer now, away from the scale of the whole animal, and down to the place where this part of the story actually began, because giant prehistoric reptiles have a way of sounding distant until one of their bones turns up on an ordinary beach in England. The new specimen that led to the naming of Ichthyotitan sevenensis came from Blue Anchor on the Somerset coast, from the uppermost Triassic Westbury Mudstone Formation, in rocks dating to the latest Rhaetian, about 202 million years ago. That makes it not only a remarkable fossil find, but a very late one in the long history of giant Triassic ichthyosaurs, appearing close to the end Triassic extinction interval. The earlier matching specimen had been found at Lilstock, about 10 kilometres along the coast, in the same formation, and from the same broad slice of time. That detail matters because the discovery is not just one odd bone from one odd day. It is a repeated signal from the same coastline, in the same rocks, from the final stretch of the Triassic, saying that something very large was there. Blue Anchor today does not look like the kind of place that should casually hand over evidence of one of the largest marine reptiles ever formally described. It looks, in the best possible British way, like a place where the weather may or may not cooperate, where the sea keeps its own schedule, and where fossil hunters walk slowly enough to make everyone else wonder whether they are deeply thoughtful or simply very committed to staring at mudstones. And that is part of what makes the discovery so satisfying. There was no dramatic expedition into an unmapped wilderness. In 2020, Justin Reynolds and his daughter Ruby were simply fossil collecting on the beach at Blue Anchor when the first part of the bone entered the story. According to the paper, the first piece, a large but slightly worn section, had been left by an anonymous member of the public on a large boulder at the top of the beach, presumably because it looked like it might be worth someone's attention. Which is a marvellous detail. Somewhere, unknowingly, a stranger helped place a fragment of a giant Triassic jaw in the path of the people who would realise what it was. That first collected piece was recovered on May 28, 2020. Justin and Ruby did what good fossil hunters do when something unusual appears. They did not simply admire it, take a photograph, and head home feeling pleasantly mysterious. They searched the area properly. Ruby, who was 11 at the time, found a better preserved and larger section nearby, one that showed a distinct anatomical feature called the Michaelian Canal, which helped identify it as part of an ichthyosaur surangula, a major bone of the lower jaw. The moment is easy to miss in summary, but it is the hinge of the whole discovery. One piece on its own can be interesting. Two pieces, found together, and one of them preserving a clear diagnostic feature, change the tone immediately. That is the point where a beach walk becomes fieldwork. It is also the point where somebody's day becomes substantially more complicated, because once you suspect you have found part of the jaw of a giant ichthyosaur, you do not really get to shrug and go back to collecting ammonites. Justin and Ruby compared what they had found with the giant surangula from Lilstock that had already been described in 2018 by Dean Lomax and colleagues. That earlier Lilstock specimen, discovered in 2016 by fossil collector Paul de la Salle, had already suggested that huge ichthyosaurs were present in the latest Triassic of the UK estimates, based on the Lilstock and related giant jaw material had put some of these animals in the range of roughly 22 to more than 30 metres in length, though those numbers, sensibly, came with caution because the remains were fragmentary. What the Blue Anchor find offered was not a completely new idea, but a stronger case. It matched the Lilstock jaw in overall form and unusual morphology, but it was more complete and better preserved. In science, especially in paleontology, that is often how the real progress happens. One specimen raises eyebrows. A second, better specimen makes everybody sit down and start measuring. Once Lomax and de la Salle were informed, several trips to the site followed, and more pieces of the same specimen were recovered over time by Justin Reynolds, Ruby Reynolds, Paul de la Salle, Dean Lomax, and others. The most recently collected piece was found by de la Salle on October 16, 2022. In total, the Blue Anchor surangula turned out to consist of at least 12 associated sections. The better preserved middle and posterior part was found in situ, while more anterior pieces were scattered on the foreshore and showed greater wear from erosion. The associated fragments were grouped into two main portions by the researchers, simply labelled Part A and Part B. Even that plain naming has a certain charm. When one is dealing with the lower jaw of a giant marine reptile from the edge of a mass extinction, there is no need for dramatic labels. Part A and Part B are quite enough. The combined preserved length of those portions was 145 centimetres, and the missing gap plus extra anterior fragments led the team to estimate that the complete surangula would have been more than 2 metres long. Now, a surangula is not a word most people need in daily life, which is probably for the best. But in this case, it deserves a clear introduction, because the whole animal is currently being inferred from this one major jaw element and its match from Lilstock. The surangula is a long bone along the lower jaw, just behind the teeth in reptiles like ichthyosaurs. In the Blue Anchor specimen, the best preserved middle to posterior section alone measured about 99 centimetres, while the more anterior preserved section measured 46 centimetres, and an estimated minimum missing gap of 38 centimetres sat between them. That reconstruction is what pushed the total jawbone estimate beyond 2 metres. The preserved posterior end was tall, thick, and naturally curved almost 90 degrees, a shape that had been suspected in the Lilstock specimen, but could now be confirmed because the Blue Anchor material was less distorted. It also reached a preserved maximum height of 26 centimetres at the posterior end. These are not decorative details. This is the slow work by which a broken bone stops being a curiosity and starts becoming a defined anatomical structure from a definable kind of animal. There is something almost funny about the contrast involved. A beach can offer shells, driftwood, seaweed, the occasional bottle cap, and if it is feeling especially generous, the lower jaw of a reptile so large that its single surangula outdoes the same bone in Tyrannosaurus rex several times over. Reuters quoted study co-author James Waldron noting that the surangula in T-Rex is over 0.5 metre long, while the one found by Ruby and Justin stretched beyond 2 metres. That comparison should not be abused because the animals were built for completely different worlds, but it is useful in one respect. It translates specialist anatomy into something the rest of us can feel in our bones, if you will forgive that. This was not a big fossil by beach standards. It was a big fossil by almost any vertebrate standard you care to name. And yet, for all its size, it did not emerge as one clean object. It came out in pieces, weathered, abraded, partly buried, easy to miss unless you knew how to look. The sea had not hidden it perfectly. It had merely hidden it well enough. The bone itself also carried marks of what had happened to it after the animal died, and before anyone ever thought to call it ichthyotitan. The researchers reported signs of abrasion, encrusting organisms including bivalves on the surface, and probable scavenging or scratch-like traces. In other words, the jaw did not go straight from living animal to museum drawer. It spent time in a working seafloor environment, exposed long enough for other organisms to make use of it, and for physical processes to wear it down. The paper also mentions additional loose bones found in the vicinity, including rib fragments, vertebrae, a phalanx, 2 large rib sections embedded higher in a bivalve bed, and even a large coprolite containing fish scales. The authors were careful not to assign those finds to the same individual without evidence, and that caution is exactly right. But even with that caution in place, the picture becomes richer. This was not a sterile geological layer containing one neat specimen. It was an active ancient environment, one that had left behind a mixed record of death, scavenging, transport, burial and exposure. The beach at Blue Anchor was not just yielding a bone, it was leaking pieces of an ecosystem. That matters because fossil discoveries can sometimes sound cleaner in retelling than they are in reality. We like the tidy version. Child finds giant bone. Experts confirm giant species. New prehistoric titan enters public life with an illustration and a Latin name. And all of that is true as far as it goes. But the actual process was slower and much more grounded. A first piece lay on a boulder, a second piece was spotted nearby, more trips followed. Additional fragments were recovered over more than 2 years. The exact locality has not been publicly disclosed, because the researchers think more material from the same individual may still be there. That restraint is sensible and, in its own way, exciting. It means the story is not fully exhausted. Somewhere in those rocks there may still be more jaw, or more of the skull, or some other part of a body that would tell us more than the surangula alone can. Fossil papers are often read as conclusions. This one can also be read as an address. It points to a stretch of coast and says, as politely as scientific writing ever does, there may be more. The match with Lilstock is the other reason the Blue Anchor specimen matters so much. The earlier surangula from Lilstock had already been recognised as belonging to a giant ichthyosaur, but the Blue Anchor jaw showed the same unusual morphology with better preservation, enough for the researchers to feel justified in naming a new genus and species, Ichthyotitan severnensis. The Blue Anchor specimen became the holotype, the name-bearing specimen for the species, because it is more complete and generally better preserved than the Lilstock bone. The two together show the same distinctive features and come from the same age and region. That is how this animal moved from possibility to formal identity. Not by a sudden leap of imagination, but by a second jaw confirming the first. Science can be gloriously dramatic in its implications, but the mechanism is usually very plain. One field collector finds a specimen, another specimen turns up. Morphology is compared, stratigraphy is checked, histology is sampled, measurements are tested, a name is proposed. A giant that had existed for 202 million years without one finally gets introduced properly. The histology added another layer. Thin sections taken from the Blue Anchor bone showed features such as primary bone, high superficial cortical vascularization, and the absence of an external fundamental system, which together suggest the individual was still growing, likely a subadult or early adult, not an animal that had already reached a final asymptotic size. That is a technical way of saying something quietly outrageous. The jawbone from Blue Anchor was already from an animal estimated around 25 metres long, or broadly within a 20 to 26 metre range according to the paper's cautious discussion, and the evidence suggests it may not yet have finished growing. The researchers were careful not to overstate this, because the remains are fragmentary, and more complete specimens would be needed to confirm the upper end of the size story. Still, even with caution left firmly in place, the implication hangs there. The Somerset shore did not preserve the remains of a fully explained, conveniently complete giant. It preserved the remains of a giant that may have had some growing left to do. That is not the sort of information that helps a mind feel smaller amounts of awe. There is also a nice human symmetry to the cast of people involved. Paul de la Salle found the earlier Lilstock specimen in 2016. Justin and Ruby Reynolds found the crucial Blue Anchor material in 2020. All three became co-authors on the 2024 paper, alongside the academic researchers. The Natural History Museum highlighted that inclusion, and rightly so. It reflects how discoveries like this really happen in Britain, where an expert eye can belong to a university paleontologist, a long-time fossil collector, or an 11-year-old who knows enough to stop and look carefully. The public retellings naturally compared Ruby Reynolds to Mary Anning, and one should be careful with historic parallels, because people deserve to be themselves. Still, there is something undeniably pleasing about the fact that one of the most striking recent discoveries in marine reptile paleontology involved a young fossil hunter on an English beach. The setting has not changed all that much. The cliffs still erode, the tides still work the shore, the old bones still come out in pieces, someone still has to notice them. By this point, the Somerset coast has done more than provide a backdrop. It has established the method of the whole story. Nothing here is based on fantasy or exaggeration. It is based on a beach, a boulder, a child noticing a second piece, a comparison to an earlier specimen from Lilstock, repeated visits, 12 associated fragments, and the slow confidence that comes from matching anatomy and matching rocks from matching time. That is why this part of the story matters so much. Before we imagine the body, before we ask how large the animal really was, before we place it in the broader world of late Triassic oceans, we have to stay here for a moment with the bone itself and the shore that gave it up. Because once a giant is reduced to fragments, almost everything depends on reading one surviving piece properly. And in this case, one lower jawbone from Blue Anchor turned out to be large enough, distinctive enough, and well preserved enough to force open the next question, which is where the scale of the animal really starts to become difficult to ignore, because hidden inside that jaw was the outline of something much bigger. A giant animal does not always announce itself with a complete skeleton, a perfect skull, or a museum-ready pose. Sometimes it arrives in a much less cooperative form. A few weathered pieces of lower jaw turn up on a beach, and the entire burden falls on anatomy. If the bone is distinctive enough, if the preserved features are unusual enough, and if there is another specimen nearby in time and place to compare it with, then one surviving part can begin to speak for the whole animal. That is exactly what happened here. Ichthyotitan severnensis was named from giant cerangular bones, major elements of the lower jaw, with the Blue Anchor specimen chosen as the holotype because it is more complete and better preserved than the earlier Lilstock jaw. Both bones come from the latest Triassic of Somerset. Both share the same unusual morphology, and together they support the case for a new giant ichthyosaur taxon. Now, a lower jawbone may not sound like the most glamorous route to a prehistoric titan. It lacks the crowd-pleasing charm of a giant tooth, or the immediate drama of a skull with everything still attached in the right order. But the cerangular matters, especially in an animal this large, because it is not some minor sliver tucked away in an obscure corner of the body. It is part of the lower jaw framework, a load-bearing element in a place where forces matter. If you're trying to understand a very large marine reptile, the jaw is not a bad place to start. The jaw has to open, close, resist stress, anchor muscle attachments, and hold its shape while interacting with the rest of the skull. In a giant ichthyosaur, that means the bone is telling you not only about identity, but about scale and mechanics. A creature at this size does not get casual engineering. The Blue Anchor cerangular is impressive before anyone even begins the comparison work. The preserved material comes in two main sections, with a combined preserved length of 145 centimetres, and the missing gap plus additional anterior fragments led the authors to estimate that the complete bone would have been more than 2 metres long. That number is the first real jolt. 2 metres for one lower jawbone is large enough to make the anatomy feel less like a technical discussion, and more like a practical inconvenience. It is the sort of bone that, if leaned carelessly in a hallway, would become everybody's problem. The Natural History Museum summarised it plainly. The fossil jawbone found at Blue Anchor measured more than 2 metres long and may have come from an animal around 25 metres in length. Still, size alone is not enough. A very large broken bone could belong to something big without proving it belonged to something new. What made the Blue Anchor specimen so valuable was the combination of size and form. The diagnosis in the paper lists a set of distinctive traits in the surangula. The posterior end bends upward at almost 90 degrees. The shaft at the coronoid region is subcircular in cross-section, unlike the oblong shape seen in Shonisaurus popularis. The coronoid process has only a minor eminence in lateral view, rather than a large projection, and it is bulbous, laterally displaced, and occupies only half the width of the dorsal surface. The bone also carries a massively developed MAME ridge for muscle attachment, and a spatulate posterior end. In plain terms, the jaw was not merely huge, it had a particular build, a particular set of proportions, and a particular arrangement of features that made it recognisably the same kind of thing as the Lilstock specimen, and different enough from better-known giant ichthyosaurs to justify a new name. That almost 90-degree bend at the back of the jaw deserves a second look because it sounds so odd, and it is. The rear of the surangular curves sharply upward, and in the Blue Anchor specimen this curvature is preserved in a natural position because the bone is less distorted than the Lilstock example. That was important. The earlier specimen had already hinted at an unusual shape, but distortion leaves room for doubt. A fossil can be made strange by geology after death, and paleontologists are rightly suspicious of that possibility. The Blue Anchor surangula gave the researchers a cleaner version of the same underlying architecture. The same strong dorsoventral curvature appeared again, now in a better preserved specimen, which helped show that this was anatomy, not damage pretending to be anatomy. There is a certain quiet triumph in that. The rock had bent and battered many things, but not enough to hide the design completely. Another feature that mattered was the huge MAME ridge. That term refers to an attachment area for part of the jaw musculature, the musculus adductor mandibulae externus, which is a splendidly formal way of saying this is one of the places where the jaw-closing machinery leaves its mark. In the Blue Anchor specimen, this ridge is described as massive, prominent and extensive, with clear muscle attachment scars. The dorsoventral height rises dramatically in the region of the bend, and the authors used measurements from this part of the bone in their size comparisons. In effect, the jaw was not just long. It was heavily built in a way that reflects the demands placed on a giant skull. One should be careful not to sprint from big muscle attachment to overconfident claims about feeding style, because the specimen is still fragmentary and the full skull remains unknown. But one can say comfortably that this was a robust jaw element from a very large animal, not a delicate strip from some lightly built swimmer. It has the look of bone that expected serious work. The Blue Anchor specimen also corrected part of the earlier interpretation of the Lilstock jaw, and this is where the story becomes especially satisfying. The better preserved anatomy showed that the position of the coronoid process and the MAME process in the Lilstock specimen had been identified incorrectly in the earlier paper because distortion had misled the reconstruction. Once the Blue Anchor surangula made the layout clearer, the researchers revised the comparison points used for scaling. This did not make the animal suddenly small, which would have been a deeply anticlimactic outcome. Quite the opposite. Using the corrected anatomy, they still arrived at largest total length estimate of about 25 metres, keeping the animal broadly in the 20 to 25 metre range, and aligning with a second comparison that also yielded about 25 metres. Science, at its best, does this sort of thing without panic. It says we were slightly wrong about this feature, we corrected it, we measured again, and the giant remains inconveniently giant. Those scaling comparisons are worth slowing down for, because this is the heart of how a giant hides in a jaw. The authors compared the blue anchor and lilstock surangulars with better-known ichthyosaurs whose body lengths are more securely understood. One comparison involved Bessanosaurus leptorhynchus, which has a total body length around 5.4 meters. Based on the revised measurement at the MAME region, the Somerset jaws appeared almost 5 times larger, suggesting an upper estimate of about 25 meters. To test that simple scaling, the team also compared the distance between the MAME and coronoid processes in the blue anchor specimen with the same region in a 3-dimensionally preserved surangula of Ophthalmosaurus acinicus. In Ophthalmosaurus, that distance measured 4 centimeters. In the blue anchor specimen, it measured 20 centimeters, 5 times greater again, and once again the estimate landed at about 25 meters. When 2 different comparisons point in the same general direction, confidence improves, even if caution remains in place. Caution, in this case, is not an irritating footnote. It is part of what makes the conclusion persuasive. The paper is explicit that the specimen is fragmentary, and that more complete remains would be needed to confirm the giant size with stronger precision. The authors say the taxon has an estimated body length of around 25 meters, or at least somewhere in the 20 to 26 meter range, and they reiterate that this is based on incomplete material. That is exactly the right tone. They are not claiming a neatly weighed and measured 300-ton monster with every decimal point tucked in place. They are saying the jaw is more than 2 meters long. The morphology matches another giant surangula from nearby lilstock. The scaling comparisons converge on something around 25 meters, and the animal very likely represents the largest estimate for a prehistoric marine reptile formally described so far. It is a large claim, but it is presented with the sort of restraint that usually means it should be taken seriously. There is one more twist inside the bone, and it makes the whole thing larger in a way that is almost rude. Histological analysis of the blue anchor specimen indicates that the animal was still growing at the time of death, likely a subadult or early adult that had not yet reached its asymptotic growth stage. The paper points to features such as the presence of primary bone, high superficial cortical vascularization, the absence of an external fundamental system, and an incompletely remodeled cortex as evidence for continued growth. The Natural History Museum summarized the implication in a single disarming line. This individual was still growing, so questions remain as to just how large these giants of the sea could grow. That is the kind of sentence that sounds calm until you think about it properly. An animal already estimated around blue whale length may not have finished. It is hard not to feel that prehistoric life occasionally behaved as though nobody had explained moderation to it. The jaw also hints at something unusual in bone development. The blue anchor specimen appears to preserve what may be part of the angular fused to the strangula along much of its length, with a straight groove marking the junction at the surface, but internal continuity across the bone suggesting fusion in life. The authors note that this would be unusual and possibly unique among ichthyosaurs, perhaps related to the animal's large size and mature state. They also describe the histology as supporting earlier suggestions of a typical osteogenesis in giant ichthyosaur lower jaws. This is where anatomy starts to sound almost industrial. The jaw is not only scaled up, it may also have been built in a somewhat unusual way to cope with the demands of being very large. Again, one should not overreach, because there is still too much we do not know about the full skull. But it is fair to say the jaw was not a standard issue ichthyosaur element enlarged on a photocopier. It seems to have had its own structural peculiarities, and then there is the simple visual fact of it. The rear end of the bone expands into a large spatulate concavity for receiving the articular bone. The surface is pitted with foramina and muscle scars. The Machelian canal opens posteriorly into a large fossa. The coronoid region is robust and subcircular in cross-section. These are all technical points, but together they create a clear impression. This was a jaw built at a scale where every ordinary anatomical feature starts looking over-engineered. Even the language of description shifts from modest to muscular. Massive ridge, large fossa, robust shaft, spatulate posterior end. Scientists write in measured prose, but the bone still bullies adjectives out of them. Of course, a jaw is not a whole animal, and it is important not to let the imagination run too far ahead of the evidence. We do not have a complete skull. We do not have the full body. We do not know all the proportions with certainty, and we should be very careful with labels like superpredator, because the paper itself is cautious about the animal's exact affinities and says the material is too incomplete for a definitive referral beyond probable Shastasaurid affinities. What we do have, however, is enough to say that giant ichthyosaurs in the latest Triassic of the UK were real, that Ichthyotitan severnensis is supported by 2 matching giant sarangulars from Somerset, and that the more complete jaw points to an animal around 25 metres long, perhaps in a 20 to 26 metre range. That is already an extraordinary amount to recover from one part of a face. There is something almost appropriate about the fact that the giant is hidden in a jaw rather than laid out all at once. That is how deep time usually behaves. It does not reveal itself cleanly. It leaves a hinge, a ridge, a fragment, a corrected interpretation, and asks whether we can build the rest with enough care. Here the answer appears to be yes, at least in outline. The jaw says the animal was huge. The matching jaw says it was not a fluke. The histology says it was still growing. The anatomy says it was distinctive. The comparisons say the length estimate is not casual guesswork. And all of that together gives us a marine reptile so large that the next sensible step is to stop thinking of it as an isolated curiosity and start placing it among the other giants that came before whales, in a world where reptiles had already learned how to take the sea to extremes. It helps at this point to step back from the jaw itself and look at the larger timeline, because one of the easiest mistakes to make with a fossil like Ichthyotitan severnensis is to place it mentally into the wrong world. When most people imagine giants of the sea, they think first of whales. That makes sense. Modern oceans train us to do that. Blue whales are the standard by which marine size is measured, and for good reason. They can grow to around 31 metres in length and weigh up to about 160 tonnes, making them the largest animals known to have lived. But the important thing here is that whales arrived very late in the story. The earliest fossil whales are known from rocks about 50 million years old in the Eocene, and the first of them was still closely tied to their land mammal ancestry. Ichthyotitan, by contrast, lived around 200 or 2 million years ago. That means giant ichthyosaurs were already operating at whale-like scale roughly 150 million years before the first true whales appear in the fossil record. The title of ocean giant belonged to reptiles long before it belonged to mammals. That single comparison changes the feel of the whole subject. It tells us that modern whales are not the first experiment in extreme marine size. They are simply the latest successful one, long before a blue whale calf was born in any ocean, long before baleen whales evolved, long before the first early whale with awkward legs was feeling its way into coastal water. Ichthyosaurs had already gone through their own rise, expansion, specialization, and giant phase. The Natural History Museum puts it very clearly. The earliest ocean giants were reptiles, and ichthyosaurs were the first tetrapods to reach truly gigantic sizes. That is not a small historical footnote. It means the sea had already tested the upper limits of vertebrate body size once before, in a completely different branch of life. Ichthyosaurs themselves were not dinosaurs, though popular culture has spent many years cheerfully throwing anything extinct and impressive into the same cupboard. They were marine reptiles, more closely comparable in ecological role to later whales than in ancestry. Britannica describes ichthyosaurs as extinct aquatic reptiles, many of which were very similar to porpoises in appearance and habits. That outward similarity is a classic case of convergent evolution. When very different groups solve the same physical problem, in this case moving efficiently through water, they often end up with similar answers. A streamlined body helps. Limbs turn into paddles or flippers. A tail becomes the main engine. The head narrows. Drag is reduced. The sea, in its quiet, practical way, rewards shapes that work. Ichthyosaurs and whales did not inherit that form from one another. They arrived there separately because water is demanding, and has very few sense of humour exceptions. The pace at which ichthyosaurs became gigantic is one of the most remarkable parts of the story. According to the 2024 Ichthyotitan paper, ichthyosaurs emerged in the early Triassic, and reached giant body size within only 3 to 5 million years of their first appearance. The paper cites Cymbospondylus youngerum from the early Middle Triassic of Nevada, estimated at around 15 to 17 metres long, as evidence that this growth in scale happened very quickly. In evolutionary terms, that is an alarmingly fast promotion from newcomer to Leviathan. Most groups do not stroll into a recovering post-extinction world and almost immediately decide to become larger than a bus. Ichthyosaurs apparently did. The Natural History Museum's summary of the discovery makes the same point, noting that individuals up to 17 metres long emerged just a few million years after the group first appeared in the fossil record. To understand why that matters, it helps to remember where in Earth history this was happening. The Triassic followed the end-Permian mass extinction, the worst mass extinction known, after which ecosystems on land and in the sea were damaged on a very large scale. The world of the early and middle Triassic was not a settled, modern-looking place with stable, familiar food webs waiting to be politely occupied. It was a rebuilt world, full of ecological vacancies, shifting climates, and opportunities for groups able to move quickly into new roles. Ichthyosaurs were among those groups. They returned fully to the sea, specialised rapidly, and by the late Triassic, some lineages had become huge. The 2024 paper notes that it was during the late Triassic that the largest known ichthyosaurs emerged, particularly forms assigned to the family Shastasauridae. That family name, Shastasauridae, tends to appear whenever discussions turn to marine reptiles of truly awkward size. The 2024 paper specifically mentions Shonisaurus popularis at around 16 metres and Shonisaurus sicaniensis at around 21 metres as examples of giant late Triassic ichthyosaurs. Smithsonian Magazine, summarising the broader picture, notes that the Triassic was clearly a heyday for the biggest ichthyosaurs, and quotes Dean Lomax saying that their top estimates range from about 82 to more than 98 feet, or roughly 25 to more than 30 metres. That range helps explain why the Somerset finds matter so much. Ichthyotitan is not a giant in a vacuum. It belongs to a larger story in which giant ichthyosaurs appeared across parts of North America, Europe and elsewhere during the Triassic, with some of the most extreme forms clustering in the mid to late Triassic. There is a temptation, when hearing about these animals, to imagine them all as versions of the same creature with minor edits, rather like a toy company releasing a larger and slightly moodier model each holiday season. But ichthyosaurs were a diverse group. Britannica notes that the earliest ichthyosaurs were long-bodied, undulating swimmers without many of the specialisation seen later, while later forms became more fish-like and highly adapted for life in the water. Some were modest in size, some were large but not immense, some had body plans suited to speed, some had skull and tooth arrangements that suggest different feeding strategies. By the late Triassic, however, certain lineages had crossed into a very different category entirely, where body size itself becomes one of the defining ecological facts. Once an animal reaches 15, 20 or perhaps 25 metres in length, it changes the scale of everything around it. Prey size, swimming efficiency, heat balance, growth rate, resource demands and reproduction all begin to operate under different pressures. Gigantism is not just largeness with extra bragging rights, it is a different way of living. One of the more useful comparisons is not actually with the blue whale, but with the history of whales themselves. The earliest whales, as Smithsonian Ocean explains, were four-legged mammals that foraged in rivers and estuaries around 50 million years ago in what is now South Asia. Over the next several million years, they diversified into forms that were increasingly aquatic, and by around 40 million years ago, fully aquatic early whales such as Basilosaurus had appeared. In other words, whales took time to become whales in the modern sense. They began on land, entered the water gradually, and only much later did some whale lineages evolve the filter feeding strategies and gigantic body sizes we associate with the great baleen whales today. Ichthyosaurs did not follow that path. They were marine reptiles, not mammals, and their rush into giant size happened much earlier and much faster in geological history. They reached Leviathan scale in the Triassic while the ancestors of whales still lay unimaginably far in the future. That point is worth lingering on because it gives the Somerset fossil its proper weight. When the 2024 paper says Isthyotitan severnensis probably represents the largest marine reptile formerly described, it is not just making a claim about one animal, it is reopening an old chapter in Earth history and reminding us that marine gigantism has had more than one dominant caste. There was a reptile age of giants in the sea, and it was not a brief novelty. Giant ichthyosaurs persisted through much of the late Triassic. The Somerset specimens come from the latest Ratian, about 202 million years ago, very near the end Triassic mass extinction. That places Ichthyotitan among the final representatives of this giant-bodied marine reptile tradition, which the paper suggests likely vanished in that extinction event and was never matched again in ichthyosaur size afterward. There is also an odd comfort in the fact that the ocean has repeatedly produced giant vertebrates from very different starting materials. Mammals managed it. Reptiles managed it. The sea seems to have a recurring appetite for scale. Part of the reason may be physical. Water supports body mass. It reduces the mechanical penalties that land imposes on very large bodies. Buoyancy helps. Thermal stability helps. If food resources are abundant enough and the ecological circumstances line up properly, a marine animal can become enormous in ways that would be much harder on land. That does not mean gigantism is easy. Far from it. It means the ocean makes it possible, and when evolution gets the combination right, very large forms can appear. The details differ, but the broad pattern is familiar. A lineage enters marine life, streamlines its shape, improves locomotion, expands in size, and eventually produces forms so large that they become the reference point for everybody else. The Triassic did it with ichthyosaurs. The Cenozoic did it with whales. Still, there are important differences between the two giant lineages. Blue whales are baleen whales that feed on small prey, mainly dense patches of krill by engulfing huge volumes of water. Noah notes that blue whales are planktivorous and can consume up to 8 tons of prey during feeding periods. Their size is tied in part to a very specific feeding system built around bulk intake of abundant small animals. Giant Triassic ichthyosaurs may not have lived in that way at all. The 2024 Ichthyotitan paper is cautious about exact ecology because the remains are incomplete, and that caution should be respected. Giant size does not automatically tell us whether an animal was a hunter of large prey, a specialist on soft-bodied cephalopods, or something less obvious. Some giant Triassic ichthyosaurs have been interpreted in different ways over time, and not all of them fit the same model. So when we compare Ichthyotitan to a blue whale, the most reliable comparison is scale, not lifestyle. One tells us how large. It does not necessarily tell us how it ate or behaved. The known giant Triassic ichthyosaurs also show that size alone did not erase variation. Shonisaurus popularis, for example, is known from Nevada and has a long history of study, with dozens of individuals recovered from Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park. The 2024 Ichthyotitan paper cites Shonisaurus popularis at around 16 metres and S. sicaniensis at around 21 metres. A 2022 Current Biology paper on Shonisaurus described evidence consistent with grouping behaviour in a moderately deep, low-diversity tropical marine environment. That is interesting, not because it gives us a direct window into Ichthyotitan specifically, which it does not, but because it reminds us that giant ichthyosaurs were real animals embedded in real ecosystems, not simply oversized outlines. They may have gathered, migrated, bred in particular settings, or used habitats in ways we are only beginning to understand. The more gigantic they become in our imagination, the more important it is to remember they were not floating abstractions. They had lives, constraints and habitats. Even Titans still had to do ordinary biological things, though admittedly on a scale that would make ordinary biology sit down for a moment. The most striking thing about Ichthyotitan, then, is not just that it was huge. It is that it belongs to the closing stretch of a very old experiment in marine gigantism. By the time it was alive in the latest Triassic seas around Somerset, giant ichthyosaurs had already been around for millions of years. They were not prototypes. They were the mature end of a successful radiation, and yet the timing is cruel. The stratigraphic horizon above the Somerset finds record signs of catastrophe associated with the end Triassic extinction. The 2024 paper notes extensive seismite and tsunamite rocks in this interval, and states that it is probable this giant lineage vanished during the end Triassic mass extinction event. That leaves Ichthyotitan standing in a very particular place in history. It is not merely a giant from the age before whales. It is one of the last giants of its own reptilian line, living near the point where that line would break. That adds a certain realism to the idea of titans before whales. They were enormous, yes. They reached a scale we still compare to modern blue whales, yes. They dominated the size story of the sea long before mammals got there, yes. But they were also vulnerable to environmental disruption. However successful they had been, however quickly they had evolved giant size, however well adapted they were to Triassic seas, they were not permanent. The age of giant ichthyosaurs ended. Smaller ichthyosaurs survived across the boundary and diversified later, but the giant shastosaurid scale forms appear to have gone with the crisis. The sea had produced titans, and then the sea, or more accurately the changing planetary system around it, remove the conditions that kept those titans going. So when we say that before whales there were titans, that is not a dramatic flourish added for effect. It is a literal description of the sequence. First came the reptilian giants of the Triassic oceans, among them forms like Shonisaurus and now Ichthyotitan. Much later came the early whales, first still tied to land, then fully aquatic, and eventually the modern giant baleen whales. The ocean has changed rulers before. It has handed scale from one lineage to another across spans of time so large that human history disappears inside them. And with Ichthyotitan, found not as a complete spectacle, but as a great lower jaw on a Somerset shore, we are being reminded that the earlier rulers were not smaller rehearsal versions of modern whales. They were their own answer to the problem of being vast in the sea, built on reptile bones, Triassic ecosystems, and an evolutionary surge that reached extremes before whales even existed. And once that settles in properly, the next thing the mind wants to know is just how large this Somerset animal may really have been. Because saying whale-sized is one thing, but pinning down what that means in flesh, mass and proportion is where the scale becomes hard to shrug off. This is the point in the story where everybody wants a single clean number, preferably one dramatic enough to make the room go quiet for a second. It is understandable. Once you hear that a giant jawbone from Somerset belonged to a newly named marine reptile, and once you hear that the animal may have rivaled a blue whale in length, the next question arrives almost automatically. How big was it really? Not in the loose sense, not in the museum gift shop sense, not in the bigger than a bus sense, though that remains technically useful. People want length, weight, comparison, rank, and ideally one alarming statistic they can repeat to somebody else over breakfast. The trouble is that paleontology is not always in the mood to provide breakfast-friendly certainty, especially when the animal in question is known from incomplete lower jawbones. In this case, the science gives us something both impressive and slightly more careful than the headline version. The 2024 paper describing Ichthyotitan severnensis estimates the animal at around 25 metres long, or at least somewhere in the 20 to 26 metre range, based on the blue anchor and lilstock surangulars. The same paper also stresses that these remains are fragmentary, and that more complete specimens are needed to confirm the giant size more securely. That is the first important distinction. There is a published size estimate, and it is enormous, but it is mainly a length estimate, not a precise body mass calculation worked out from a complete skeleton. The paper's own wording is measured. The more complete surangula would have been more than 2 metres long, from an individual with a body length estimated at about 25 metres. Later in the discussion, after revising some earlier anatomical interpretations, the authors still arrive at the same broad conclusion, roughly 25 metres at the upper end, still within about a 20 to 25 metre range by one comparison, and around 25 metres again by another. Then, near the end, they summarise the taxon as having an estimated body length of around 25 metres, or at least somewhere in the 20 to 26 metre range, while repeating that more complete remains are required to confirm the giant size. So when we talk about how big Ichthyotitan was, the strongest supported number is its estimated length. That part of the argument is serious. That part is in the paper, and 25 metres is already a deeply inconvenient size for the human imagination. That is about 82 feet. It is long enough that the comparison with a modern blue whale is not a bit of colourful exaggeration added later by journalists trying to keep everyone awake. The Natural History Museum put it directly when covering the discovery. This giant of the oceans is estimated to have reached around 25 metres in length, which is about the size of a modern-day blue whale. The museum also notes that comparisons of the jawbones with other ichthyosaurs suggest Ichthyotitan was as much as 25 metres long, so on length, at least, the blue whale comparison is fair. That does not mean the two animals were identical in every way. It means that if you lined up the estimated body length of Ichthyotitan against a very large living whale, you would be operating in the same general order of scale. That is extraordinary enough on its own, and it is better to let that fact stand clearly than to decorate it into something shakier. Where things become less tidy is when length turns into weight. Modern blue whales are the largest animals known to have lived, and Noah lists them at up to 110 feet and up to 330,000 pounds, with another Noah page summarising blue whales as reaching up to 31 metres and having weighed up to 160 tonnes. Those figures are for actual whales, living mammals with known body plans, known soft tissue, and direct modern measurement. Ichthyotitan is not a whale. It is a giant late Triassic marine reptile, known from giant jaw material, not from a complete body. So a sentence like, "it was blue whale-sized," is defensible when it means length. A sentence like, "it definitely weighed as much as or more than a blue whale," goes well beyond what the current fossil evidence actually supports. The published 2024 description does not present a firm body mass estimate for Ichthyotitan. It gives a length estimate and emphasises the fragmentary nature of the remains. That means any exact weight figure, especially a dramatic one, should be treated with caution, unless a specific scientific source provides the method and the estimate. That brings us to the phrase 300-ton monster, which is a very good title if one's goal is to keep sleepy people from scrolling away, but not a number the 2024 paper itself actually locks down. The paper supports a giant marine reptile around 25 metres long, perhaps in a 20 to 26 metre range, and it says the animal was likely still growing. It does not say 300 tons. The length estimate is published. The still growing point is published. The exact 300-ton body mass, at least in the source material reviewed here, is not. So the careful answer is this. Ichthyotitan may well have been one of the largest marine reptiles ever described, and it may have rivaled a blue whale in length, but a precise mass claim like 300 tons runs ahead of the currently published evidence. If one wants the version that sounds less theatrical, but survives better in daylight, it is that Ichthyotitan was probably whale length, not securely whale weight. Now, that caution should not be mistaken for deflation. A 25-metre reptile is not in need of embellishment. It is already a ridiculous animal by any ordinary standard. To understand why the researchers arrived at that figure, it helps to look at how the estimate was made. The blue anchor specimen is a surangula, one of the major bones of the lower jaw, and the preserved material plus the missing gap suggested that the complete bone would have been more than 2 metres long. The researchers then compared measurements from that jaw region with the same region in better-known ichthyosaurs. One comparison used Bessonosaurus leptorhynchus, a much smaller ichthyosaur with a total body length of 5.4 metres. Based on the revised measurement, the Somerset animal appeared almost 5 times larger, suggesting a largest total length estimate of 25 metres. A second comparison using Ophthalmosaurus isenicus reached essentially the same result. When 2 different scaling routes land in the same place, that does not remove all uncertainty, but it does make the estimate much harder to dismiss as wishful thinking. The second reason the estimate carries weight is that the blue anchor jaw is not alone. The earlier Lilstock surangula found in 2016 had already shown that giant ichthyosaurs were present in the latest Triassic of Somerset. What the blue anchor specimen added was a better preserved and more complete example of the same unusual jaw morphology from the same formation and same general age, roughly 10 kilometres along the coast. The paper argues that 2 matching giant surangulas with the same distinctive form from the same geological setting are enough to justify a new species, Ichthyotitan severnensis. In other words, this is not a case of one odd bone being pushed into fame by enthusiasm alone. It is a repeated anatomical signal that matters for the size question, because repeated giant jaw bones from the same time and place make the existence of a truly huge animal much more convincing. There is also the matter of growth, which complicates the story in a way that somehow makes it even larger. Thin sections taken from the blue anchor specimen showed histological features consistent with a still-growing subadult or early adult that had not yet reached asymptotic growth. The paper says this explicitly, and the Natural History Museum repeats the point in more public-facing language. This individual was still growing, so questions remain as to just how large these giants of the sea could grow. That does not mean one is free to add another 10 metres in a fit of enthusiasm. It does mean the already huge size estimate may not represent the final possible maximum for the species. This is one of those moments where the cautious scientific wording is actually more unsettling than an exaggerated headline. Still growing is a very small phrase carrying a very large animal inside it. At the same time, length by itself can mislead people about overall scale if they silently convert it into mass. A 25-metre blue whale and a 25-metre ichthyosaur do not have to weigh the same simply because their lengths occupy similar territory. Body shape matters, thickness matters, the distribution of soft tissue matters. Blue whales are enormously heavy-bodied baleen whales, and NOAA's size figures show just how substantial that build can be, with Antarctic individuals reaching up to about 110 feet and more than 330,000 pounds, while another NOAA source notes blue whales have weighed up to 160 tons. Ichthyotitan is currently reconstructed from jaw material, and comparisons with other ichthyosaurs not from a full preserved body. So the safest way to compare the two is to say that Ichthyotitan may have been blue whale-like in length, while its exact body mass remains uncertain. That is less flashy than 300 tons, but much closer to what the fossils actually allow us to say. It is also worth noticing what the paper claims when it speaks about rank. The authors say Ichthyotitan sevenensis probably represents the largest marine reptile formerly described. That wording is careful in two directions at once. Probably leaves room for future revision, which is sensible. Formally described matters because paleontology is full of fragmentary giants, debated estimates, and specimens that are impressive but not always named cleanly enough to compare in a stable way. The paper even notes that if the estimates for certain older ostbones are correct, those individuals may have been even larger ichthyosaurs, so even within giant Triassic reptiles there remains room for argument. But Ichthyotitan does have a formal name, a published diagnosis, and a serious length estimate. That gives it a firm place in the conversation about the biggest marine reptiles known to science. Putting it in context helps. The same paper notes that ichthyosaurs were the first marine tetrapods to attain giant size, and that forms around 15 to 17 metres appeared only 3 to 5 million years after the group first entered the fossil record. It then names Shonisaurus popularis at around 16 metres and Shonisaurus sicaniensis at around 21 metres as other giant Triassic ichthyosaurs. Ichthyotitan sits above those length estimates, at least provisionally, around 25 metres. That is not a small step. Once you move from the high teens and low 20s into the mid-20s, you're no longer merely in the company of large marine reptiles. You're approaching the upper ceiling of vertebrate marine size. It was a post-extinction world that had rebuilt enough complexity to support large food webs. It was a greenhouse planet organised around Pangaea, Panthalassa, and the Tethys. It was a time of rising seas and expanding shelf habitats. In southwest Britain specifically, it was a marine transgression that flooded older Triassic landscapes and deposited the dark Westbury mudstones and bone beds in which giant ichthyosaur jaws would eventually be found. It was a fish-rich, regionally variable seaway, apparently deeper in North Somerset than at some eastern localities, with transport, abrasion, shell beds, pyritic muds, and enough available energy in the broader marine ecosystem to support very large ichthyosaurs high in the food web. That is the world that made a giant possible. And once that world is in view, the giant begins to look less like an isolated curiosity and more like the logical edge of a larger process. Give evolution a recovering ocean, broad marine pathways, rich fish faunas, warm seas, and enough time, and sometimes it will not stop at merely large. It will keep pressing upward until one jawbone on a Somerset shore is enough to suggest an animal around 25 metres long. That is where the next part of the story naturally goes, because once the world is strange enough to allow that, the real question becomes how evolution keeps arriving at these extremes at all, and why it so often pushes size right to the point where success starts becoming its own kind of risk. Evolution does not have a built-in preference for moderation. It is not trying to produce animals that feel reasonable to us, or balanced, or politely sized for museum halls and school diagrams. It works with whatever combination of environment, anatomy, energy, competition, and luck happens to pay off long enough to stick. Sometimes that produces a perfectly ordinary fish. Sometimes it produces a marine reptile with a lower jawbone more than 2 metres long, and an estimated body length around 25 metres. When that happens, it is tempting to treat gigantism as a kind of biological vanity project, as though life simply got carried away with itself. But extreme size usually means something more specific. It means that for a time, the rules of the environment were rewarding that scale rather than punishing it. And that really is what makes Ichthyotitan so interesting. It is not just large, it is evidence that evolution found a route to very large size in a Triassic marine reptile and kept going until the result approached blue whale length. The 2024 description of Ichthyotitan sevenensis places it at around 25 metres long, likely in a broader range of about 20 to 26 metres, and notes that the known individual was still growing. That is what an evolutionary extreme looks like in the fossil record. It arrives not as a slogan, but as a set of conditions pushed unusually far. One of the most useful things body size does is force biology to reorganize around it. Ferron and colleagues, writing about gigantism in active marine predators, describe body size as a key biological trait that affects physiology, anatomy, ecology, life history, and even the structure and dynamics of ecological networks. In other words, a giant is not just a scaled-up normal animal. Once size increases enough, everything connected to the animal starts behaving differently. How much food it needs changes, how it stores energy changes, how it interacts with prey changes, how it moves through the environment changes, how much ecological space it occupies changes. This is why giant animals always feel as though they belong to a different category, even when they are close relatives of much smaller species. The difference is not merely visual, it is systemic. A giant predator, a giant grazer, and a giant filter feeder each begin to reshape the food web around them, simply by existing at that scale. Recent work on ocean giants makes the same broader point, arguing that extreme-sized marine animals have repeatedly altered food webs, energy flow, nutrient cycling, and overall ecosystem structure. So when evolution goes to extremes, it is never just the animal changing, the ecosystem changes with it. That helps explain why extreme size has evolved more than once in the ocean. The annual review overview on ocean giants argues that, across geological time, an intertwined relationship between ecology and evolution has allowed distant clades to attain gigantism, from Triassic ichthyosaurs to later sharks and whales. The same review says ecological opportunities, from vacant niches to shifts in ocean productivity, promoted key adaptations that enhanced prey intake and enabled species to reach extreme sizes. That is a very useful framework because it shifts the question away from why did this one lineage become huge, and toward what sort of opportunity landscape allows gigantism at all. The answer is usually not a single cause, it is a combination. There has to be available energy in the system. There has to be a body plan that can exploit it. There has to be enough ecological room for large individuals to persist and reproduce. And often there has to be some competitive or functional reason to keep increasing size rather than staying merely large enough. In the case of ichthyosaurs, those conditions aligned remarkably early and with remarkable force. The sea, of course, gives evolution options that land does not. Marine vertebrates have repeatedly reached sizes far beyond what is common on land, and Ferron and colleagues note that the biggest vertebrates in the history of life have inhabited marine environments. Water helps support mass. It lowers some of the mechanical penalties of being huge. A fully aquatic body can become elongated, heavy, and powerfully muscled without asking its skeleton to solve the same anti-gravity problems required on land. That does not make gigantism easy. It just makes it possible in ways that terrestrial life often cannot match. Yet even here there is an important limit. Ferron and colleagues also point out that the largest swimming vertebrates tend to be slow filter feeders, while active predators are notably smaller, and they tie that pattern to energetic constraints. Active predation is expensive. Chasing prey, maneuvering, accelerating, and maintaining a high-output lifestyle all place demands on metabolism. So a very large active marine predator or high-trophic marine vertebrate is not the default outcome. It is a special case. It means the lineage somehow found a way to push size upward, despite the costs that usually hold active predators back. That is one reason giant ichthyosaurs remain so striking. Modern blue whales are extreme, but they are not active predators in the same way. Noah notes that blue whales are the largest animals ever to live, up to 110 feet and 330,000 pounds, and that they feed almost exclusively on krill, straining huge volumes of water through their baleen. That is a highly specialized bulk feeding system. It is one route to huge size, because it allows an animal to harvest immense quantities of small prey efficiently. Triassic ichthyosaurs did not evolve baleen, and the known material for Ichthyoticton is too incomplete to pin down its feeding style with that level of confidence. But the key point remains: a giant marine reptile at around 25 meters, especially one likely occupying an upper trophic role rather than modern-style filter feeding, represents an extreme that is harder to evolve than a giant slow feeder. It suggests an ecosystem energetic enough and a lineage flexible enough to sustain size without relying on the exact trick used by blue whales. That makes Ichthyotitan less a reptilian imitation of a whale and more a separate experiment in getting very large under a different set of rules. There is a useful theoretical explanation for how such extremes become possible. Ferron and colleagues argue that mass-specific metabolic rate decreases with increasing body size and propose that shifts toward higher metabolic levels can allow the same activity and feeding strategy to be sustained at bigger body sizes. In plain language, there comes a point where simply making an active predator larger creates a physiological problem. The energetic demands of staying active and feeding effectively become harder to meet. But if the lineage evolves ways to run at a higher metabolic level, whether through thermophysiology or other systemic changes, it may be able to keep its lifestyle while moving into a larger size bracket. The paper presents this as a hypothesis for active marine predators broadly, not a proven specific answer for Ichthyotitan. Still, it is a very helpful lens. It reminds us that giant size is not just more bone and more flesh. It usually requires changes in the biological budget itself. Somewhere under the skin, the lineage has to make the numbers work. And evolution, on occasion, does exactly that in a way that looks suspiciously like cheating until you remember that nature has no referee. Ichthyosaurs were especially aggressive about this escalation. The 2021 science paper on Symbospondylus youngorum argues that ichthyosaurs evolved large body size faster than cetaceans did and describes a giant middle Triassic ichthyosaur with a 2-meter-long skull from Nevada. Its abstract says high primary production in modern oceans is often treated as a prerequisite for cetacean giants, but that condition cannot explain Triassic ichthyosaur gigantism. Instead, the fossil hill fauna rivaled modern marine mammal faunas in size range. An energy flux model suggests middle Triassic marine food webs were able to support several large-bodied ichthyosaurs at high trophic levels shortly after ichthyosaur origins. That is a remarkable finding, because it means ichthyosaurs were not slowly inching toward gigantism over a long, comfortable stretch of time. They got there quickly, and they did so in oceans that were not simply copies of the modern whale-producing world. Evolution, in other words, found another route. Give it a recovering post-extinction ocean, the right prey structure, the right body plan, and a lineage willing to specialize hard, and it can arrive at giant size much faster than one might expect. And once a lineage has crossed into giant territory, the advantages can begin to compound. The annual review paper emphasizes that ecological opportunities promote adaptations that enhance prey intake, ultimately enabling extreme size. That framing is important because gigantism is not usually an accident that persists by luck alone. Large size can itself become part of the solution. A very large animal can exploit wider spaces, interact with larger prey fields, and dominate energetic pathways in a way a smaller relative cannot. Even without claiming details the fossils do not prove, it is reasonable to infer from the literature that giant body size in marine vertebrates often becomes self-reinforcing once it aligns with successful prey capture and ecosystem structure. The animal is no longer just bigger. It is operating at a different ecological scale. It can become one of the things the system is built around. That is why ocean giants reshape energy flow and ecosystem structure, as the review notes. Once they appear, everybody else ends up living with the consequences. Still, an evolutionary extreme is never free. The very factors that make gigantism possible can also make it precarious. The 2024 Ichthyotitan paper stresses that giant ichthyosaurs with body length estimates exceeding 20 meters were still present in the latest Triassic of the UK, but it also places those specimens immediately below strata, indicating the end Triassic mass extinction event. The paper says it is probable that this lineage of giant ichthyosaurs vanished during that crisis, and notes that ichthyosaurs never reached this size again before their final extinction much later in the Cretaceous. That is a stark pattern. For millions of years, ichthyosaurs pushed size upward and occupied the upper reaches of marine ecosystems. Then a planetary disruption arrived, and the biggest expression of that strategy disappeared. The giant did not fail because it was poorly adapted to its own world. It failed because the world changed. Evolution can go to extremes when conditions reward them, but extreme solutions are often tied more tightly to those conditions than they first appear. This is where gigantism starts to look less like triumph and more like dependency. Ocean giant research emphasizes that the rise of extreme-sized species depends on ecological opportunity, prey intake, and broader environmental structure, and that their extinction or decline has profound and lasting ecological consequences. Read that backward, and another message appears. If the prey base shifts, if productivity changes, if habitats contract, if circulation patterns alter, if a mass extinction disrupts the web beneath the giant, then the giant is suddenly carrying a very expensive body in a less generous world. Extreme size can be a winning strategy, but it is rarely a forgiving one. You can hear that already in Ferron and colleagues, who frame body size as tightly linked to physiology, anatomy, ecology, life history, and food web dynamics. Once all of those systems are tuned to being enormous, flexibility may become harder. The giant is powerful, yes, but it is also committed. It cannot easily become modest again just because the planet has decided to become difficult. That makes Ichthyotitan a particularly good example of what evolution at the edge really looks like. It was not merely large. According to the Pielos paper, it was likely among the largest marine reptiles formerly described, known from jawbones showing a body length estimate around 25 meters, and histology consistent with an individual that was still growing. The same paper says the giant's size and geological age suggest Shastasaurid affinities, though the material remains too incomplete for a definitive referral. That uncertainty matters because it reminds us we are still dealing with fragments. But the broad shape of the story is clear enough. Ichthyosaurs entered the sea, evolved giant size rapidly, reached extreme scale long before whales existed, and in the latest Triassic were still capable of producing animals of astonishing dimensions. Ichthyotitan sits near the end of that trajectory. It is not the beginning of marine gigantism in reptiles. It is what the strategy looked like when pushed very far and held there until the environmental support gave way. There is also something quietly revealing in the comparison with whales. Blue whales remain the largest animals known, and NOAA's figures make that plain. But the route whales took to gigantism is tied to a much later ocean, different primary producers, and a specialised feeding system based on baleen and enormous krill intake. Triassic ichthyosaurs reached similar length territory under different ecological rules and in a much earlier world. That tells us evolution does not have one master plan for greatness. It has several rough methods for getting there, each of them temporary, each dependent on the right environmental support. Ocean giants arise in distant clades because the sea keeps offering opportunities for size, but it never promises permanence. That may be the most important lesson in all of this. Extremes are real. They can work magnificently. They can dominate an age, and they can still be lost when the conditions that built them shift just far enough. Which is why, once a lineage produces a creature like Ichthyotitan, the next question is not simply how impressive that achievement was, but how vulnerable a body that large becomes when the sea underneath it starts changing faster than it can. At first glance, that sounds backward. The largest creatures ought to feel the safest. A giant in the sea seems as though it should be beyond ordinary trouble, too large to be bothered, too established to be easily shaken. We instinctively treat size as a kind of insurance policy. Bigger body, bigger range, bigger jaw, bigger authority. But biology is rarely that sentimental. The same size that makes a giant impressive also makes it expensive. Recent syntheses on ocean giants note that while large size can be efficient in some ways, it comes with steep trade-offs. Very large organisms have much higher absolute energy demands, making them especially sensitive to shifts in prey supply, and body size sits at the centre of species-level dynamics, trophic interactions, and overall ecosystem structure. In other words, a giant is not simply harder to kill. A giant is harder to keep fed, harder to replace, and harder to fit into a damaged world once the environment stops cooperating. That is why fragility at giant scale is best understood not as physical weakness, but as dependence. A small animal can sometimes survive a bad patch by needing less, breeding quickly, hiding better, or shifting its habits within a narrow space. A giant usually has no such luxury. It needs a lot of food, it needs that food over large areas, and it often needs a reasonably stable ecosystem beneath it, because the entire architecture of its life is built on abundance. Among living marine mammals, the most important predictor of extinction risk is not simply where they live, but the speed of their life history, especially rate of offspring production. In that study, low reproductive output was the strongest predictor of risk, and the authors estimated that about 37% of marine mammals were at risk of extinction when both listed and model-predicted species were considered. That is a modern result, not a direct measurement of ichthyotitan, but it reveals a broader rule that matters here. When a very large marine vertebrate is knocked down, it does not bounce back quickly. There is another useful complication, because size by itself is not a universal death sentence. A broad review of extinction risk traits found that across taxa, the most consistent predictors of vulnerability were small, geographic range and narrow habitat breadth, while body size remained important, but depended strongly on the kind of threat involved. And a large-scale analysis of 485 million years of marine fossil data found that preferential extinction of smaller-bodied marine genera was often more common than extinction of larger-bodied ones. That matters because it keeps us honest. We should not say, as a simple law of nature, that the biggest animals always die first. They do not. Fragility is more specific than that. It emerges when very large size is paired with heavy energetic demands, slower population replacement, ecological specialization, or a sudden collapse in the environmental conditions that made giant size viable in the first place. So the title is true in a particular way. The biggest creatures are not always the first to go. But when the system supporting them is disrupted fast enough, their margin for error can become remarkably small. That distinction is important for ichthyotitan because we cannot directly measure its reproductive rate, age at maturity, migration pattern, or exact feeding style from a giant jawbone. The 2024 paper is careful on that point. It says the material is too incomplete for a definitive referral beyond likely Shastosaurid affinities, and it does not pretend to know every detail of the animal's ecology. What it does show is that giant ichthyosaurs with body length estimates above 20 metres were present in the latest Triassic of the UK, that the more complete Sarangula would have belonged to an individual around 25 metres long, and that the histology suggests the blue anchor individual was still growing. It also states that these animals lived right up close to the end Triassic crisis. That means we're looking at an animal already sitting at an extreme of size, already demanding a very productive marine setting, and already living near a geological moment when marine systems were about to become far less forgiving. And this is where the real fragility appears. A giant is built for one version of the world. It is built for a sea with enough prey, enough space, enough oxygen, enough ecological continuity, and enough predictability for a very large body to keep making sense. If that world persists, the giant can look unstoppable. If it begins to wobble, the same body becomes a commitment. Recent work on ocean giants emphasizes that the rise of extreme size depends on ecological opportunity and prey intake, and that giant species can profoundly alter ecosystem structure. Read in reverse, that means giant species are also unusually exposed to structural collapse in those same systems. They are not passengers, they're expensive upper-tier investments by the ecosystem. When the marine food web is rich and stable, a giant looks like a masterpiece. When prey fields shift or productivity falls, the masterpiece becomes difficult to maintain. Modern marine mammals offer a useful comparison, not because they are close relatives of ichthyosaurs, but because they show how giant marine vertebrates respond when the supporting system becomes less stable. The Marine Mammal Extinction Risk Study points to low offspring production as the strongest predictor of vulnerability, and it also links risk to small range, small social group size, and exposure to human-driven changes including warming, acidification, fishing pressure, and altered food webs. The authors note that oceans are being polluted, warmed, acidified, and overfished, and that these changes reduce prey and reshape marine habitats. Again, that is modern conservation biology, not late Triassic paleoecology. But it gives us a very clear living model for the general logic. Giant marine vertebrates are often not fragile because they are weak. They're fragile because they are tightly tied to ecological abundance, and because their recovery from losses is slow. Their lives are large, but their flexibility is not infinite. Now put that logic back into the latest Triassic, and the Somerset jaw starts to look less like the symbol of invincibility, and more like the last expression of a very demanding lifestyle. The end Triassic mass extinction, at about 201 million years ago, is widely linked to Central Atlantic magmatic province volcanism. A major review of the Triassic-Jurassic transition says that this event was associated with climatic warming, ocean acidification, and widespread water mass anoxia, producing a cascade of lethal environmental stresses in both continental and marine habitats. Those are not small disturbances. They're exactly the sort of deep systemic shocks that make gigantism dangerous. A giant can survive predators, it can survive weather, it can survive local bad luck. What it handles poorly is a planetary scale reorganisation of the ocean's chemistry and productivity. If warming, acidification and oxygen stress begin knocking at several levels of the food web at once, the biggest consumers are suddenly standing on the least stable floors. That is one reason the late fate of giant ichthyosaurs matters so much. The Natural History Museum's 2024 summary of new work on marine reptile decline says that ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were hit by two extinction events in fairly quick succession at the end of the Triassic, and that the earlier event appears to have left them more vulnerable to the later one. The same piece notes that among the casualties were the shastosaurid ichthyosaurs, whale-sized marine reptiles that could reach up to about 21 metres long, and that ichthyosaurs never again attained such massive size. The 2024 Ichthyotitan paper reaches a compatible conclusion from the Somerset material, arguing that giant ichthyosaurs were still present in the latest Triassic, and probably vanished in the end Triassic extinction, with the lineage's giant size not returning afterward. This is exactly the kind of pattern one expects when a successful but costly strategy loses the environmental support that made it work. The giants do not necessarily fade gently, they disappear as a category. There is something revealing in that phrase, never again attained such massive size. It tells us the loss was not merely taxonomic, it was ecological. Ichthyosaurs survived the boundary as a broader group, but the whale-sized forms did not return. That suggests the post-extinction world still had room for ichthyosaurs, just not for that kind of ichthyosaur. The extreme body plan had become too costly, too poorly matched to the new conditions, or too dependent on food web structures that no longer existed in the same form. That is what fragility looks like at the top. A lineage may continue, but the largest expression of its success can vanish, because the planet no longer supports the conditions that once made those dimensions viable. The biggest body is often the least transferable asset when the rules change. It cannot be shrunk overnight. It cannot be cheaply maintained. It belongs to a specific world, and once that world goes, the body goes with it. This also helps explain why giants feel so haunting in the fossil record. They are not merely large animals, they are ecological agreements. An ecosystem is, in effect, saying yes to that much vertebrate flesh at the top end, yes to the prey needed to sustain it, yes to the oxygen and chemistry required to keep the ocean working, yes to the growth rates, breeding opportunities, and habitat continuity needed to support a lineage of that size. When conditions remain favourable, the agreement can last for millions of years. When the agreement breaks, the giant does not have a graceful fallback. A smaller animal can often persist in fragments of habitat or on lower energy budgets. A giant frequently cannot. That is why, in living vertebrates, extinction risk rises again at the largest body sizes, and why conservation biologists so often find that slow life histories and low rebound capacity sit at the centre of vulnerability. The giant has power, but power is not the same thing as resilience. So when we look at Ichthyotitan, it is worth resisting the simple picture of a marine colossus that somehow failed despite being magnificent. Magnificence was the problem, or at least part of it. To reach around 25 metres in length in the latest Triassic was to embody a very high-cost solution to life in the sea. It meant the ecosystem beneath the animal had to remain generous. It meant the line of supply from lower trophic levels up to the top had to keep working. It meant the sea had to stay recognisably like the sea that built the lineage in the first place. Once volcanism, warming, acidification, oxygen stress, and broader ecosystem disruption began tearing through that arrangement, giant size stopped being an advantage and started becoming a bill the world no longer wished to pay. Which is why the next step in the story is not really about the animal alone anymore. It is about the sea losing the conditions that made such an animal possible, and about the larger collapse that turned a world capable of producing whale-sized reptiles into one that could no longer keep them. By the time Ichthyotitan was moving through the latest Triassic Sea near what is now Somerset, The ocean that had made animals like it possible was already close to breaking. That is one of the reasons the fossil feels so charged. It does not come from the beginning of a great marine expansion, it comes from the end of one. The 2024 description places the blue anchor and lilstock jawbones in the latest Ratian, around 202 million years ago, immediately below strata associated with catastrophe at the end Triassic boundary. The same paper argues that giant ichthyosaurs more than 20 metres long were still present in the latest Triassic of the UK, and that this giant lineage probably vanished in the end Triassic mass extinction, after which ichthyosaurs never again reached such size. That turns the Somerset jaw into more than a size story. It becomes evidence from the closing minutes of a marine world that had been running on giant reptiles for millions of years. The phrase lost ocean kingdom is useful here, not because the Triassic Sea was literally a kingdom with borders and a crown, but because it had a structure that now no longer exists. It had its own giant vertebrates, its own dominant reptile lineages, its own prey systems, and its own environmental rhythms. The Natural History Museum summarises the broader pattern clearly. During the Triassic, marine reptiles diversified rapidly into many forms, from ichthyosaurs in open water to long-necked plesiosaurs and other marine groups, but their expansion was halted near the end of the period by two extinction events in relatively quick succession. The same article notes that while both ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs survived as broader groups, many species did not, and among the casualties were the whale-sized shastasaurid ichthyosaurs. The giants disappeared as a category. That is exactly what the collapse of a kingdom looks like in the fossil record. The rulers do not simply get smaller, the system that supported their way of life stops working. What caused that collapse is no longer treated as a vague mystery in the way it once was. A major 2022 review of the Triassic-Jurassic transition states that the end Triassic mass extinction was triggered by eruptions of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP, a vast large igneous province associated with the early breakup of Pangaea. According to that review, the eruptions drove major changes in continental and marine habitats, including climatic warming, ocean acidification, and widespread water mass anoxia, producing a cascade of lethal environmental stresses. The review also describes the end Triassic extinction at about 201 million years ago as one of the big five mass extinctions of the Phanerozoic. So the kingdom did not collapse because one predator replaced another, or because some local shoreline changed shape, or because one unlucky group happened to lose a contest. It collapsed because the planet itself began altering the background conditions of the ocean. That volcanic trigger matters because it explains why the damage was so broad. Camp was not a single dramatic explosion followed by a tidy recovery. It was a prolonged interval of enormous volcanic activity tied to continental rifting. The 2022 Nature Communication study on the Triassic-Jurassic transition found Mercury evidence for intense volcanism far from the camp source area, and concluded that the underlying cause was climatic warming due to a contemporaneous rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide linked to the eruptions. The same study argues that intensified continental chemical weathering became a major contributor to marine perturbations leading to biotic stress and mass extinction. In other words, the volcanism did not just make the sky unpleasant, it reorganized the carbon cycle, climate, weathering, and ocean chemistry. Once those systems begin shifting together, marine giants at the top are no longer dealing with one problem. They are dealing with several, all at once, and some of them begin lower in the food web where the giant cannot negotiate with them. One of the most important of those problems was ocean acidification. For years, acidification had been suspected as a major stressor at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, but direct reconstruction was limited. That changed with the 2025 Nature Communications paper using boron isotopes from well-preserved fossil oysters at Lavernock Point in Wales, another locality within the same broad British epicontinental seaway system. The authors found evidence for a drop in ocean pH of at least 0.29 units, coincident with the main negative carbon isotope excursion after the end Triassic extinction. They interpret this as direct evidence for CO2-driven acidification associated with camp-related carbon release, and suggest that this prolonged perturbation likely delayed ecosystem recovery. The paper also notes that marine calcifiers were preferentially hit, carbonate sedimentation rates decreased, and several carbonate-producing groups did not fully recover until much later in the Jurassic. This is a key point because acidification attacks the infrastructure of marine ecosystems. It does not simply threaten one giant reptile, it weakens the chemical conditions under which many smaller shell-building organisms, reef producers and broader marine communities function. And then there was oxygen. The 2022 study of the Bristol Channel Basin and Larne Basin reports that water column anoxia was common in the European epicontinental sea through the Triassic-Jurassic transition, with more persistent euxinic, meaning anoxic and sulfidic, conditions developing precisely at the second phase of the end-Triassic extinction. The authors propose that this bottom water oxygen crisis directly drove part of the benthic faunal loss in the northwestern European epicontinental sea. That matters especially for a story centred on Somerset and nearby coasts, because the Bristol Channel Basin sits in the same regional seaway context as the Ichthyotitan finds. So this is not merely a global generalisation floating far away from the actual fossil locality. There is specific regional evidence that the waters around this part of ancient Europe experienced serious oxygen stress at exactly the wrong time. A giant marine reptile can cope with many things: a system-wide degradation of the water column, the seafloor communities and the prey base beneath it is another matter. This is where the collapse stops sounding abstract and starts sounding mechanical. First, volcanism injects huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere-ocean system. Then climate warms, acidification rises, chemical weathering intensifies, ocean circulation and oxygen structure shift. Some basins become anoxic or even euxinic for longer periods. Marine calcifiers are stressed, carbonate systems weaken, benthic communities are damaged, recovery slows. The giant consumers at the top are left depending on prey networks that are no longer as stable or as productive as before. None of these steps by itself needs to exterminate every large predator immediately, but together they make the ecosystem less able to carry expensive bodies. The 2022 Earth Science Review's paper describes exactly this kind of interconnected damage as a web of environmental changes linked by the eruptions. And a web, once damaged in enough places at once, stops behaving like a web. It becomes a set of breaks. There is also growing evidence that the final crash was not a single neat event but a more complex sequence. The Natural History Museum's 2024 summary says new research indicates marine reptiles were made more vulnerable by a previous extinction event several million years earlier, before the already known end-Triassic crisis delivered the final blow. The article describes two extinction events in quick succession near the end of the Triassic, and notes that whale-sized shastosaurid ichthyosaurs were among the casualties, with ichthyosaurs never reaching those enormous sizes again. That layered pattern is important, because it helps explain why a lineage that had succeeded for so long could still disappear relatively abruptly. Kingdoms rarely collapse only because of the final hit. They often arrive weakened first, with diversity reduced, ecological options narrowed, and resilience already compromised before the main disaster arrives. From that perspective, Ichthyotitan looks almost painfully well-timed. The PLOS paper describes it as one of the last giants, and that is not just a dramatic subtitle. The animal lived in the latest Ratian, close to the extinction boundary, and the authors explicitly connect its position in time to the likely disappearance of the giant lineage during the end-Triassic event. So the jaw from Somerset represents not merely an apex of size, but a specimen caught just before the ecological floor dropped out. It belongs to an interval in which giant ichthyosaurs still existed, still grew, still occupied those seas, but were doing so on the eve of a crisis severe enough to erase their scale from the group's future. After that point, ichthyosaurs continued, but not at this giant shastosaurid level. The sea kept some of the lineage, but not the full-size system that had once sustained it. That may be the clearest sign that this was a kingdom, and not just a set of big individuals. If a single large species disappears while closely related forms at similar size continue, that can be written off as ordinary turnover. But here the broader giant-bodied mode disappears. The Natural History Museum article on the hidden Triassic extinction states that shastosaurids, the whale-sized ichthyosaurs, went extinct, and that ichthyosaurs would never again attain such massive size. That tells us the collapse was not only taxonomic, it was structural. Whatever combination of prey supply, habitat organisation, ocean chemistry and ecological stability had allowed giant ichthyosaurs to exist in the late Triassic was no longer available in the same way afterward. The ocean did not merely replace one giant with another. It lost the capacity to support that kind of giant reptile altogether. There is a tendency, when talking about mass extinctions, to imagine everything happening at once in one cinematic wall of death. The real process is usually more frustrating than that. It can involve pulses, setbacks, partial recoveries, local differences, and ugly uneven timing. The 2022 Anoxia study found heterogeneous redox conditions between basins in the latest Rhaetian, with one basin more oxygenated than another, before more persistent euxemia spread across the boundary. The 2025 acidification paper similarly identifies a main carbon isotope excursion and a prolonged interval of CO2-driven disturbance, likely delaying ecosystem recovery. This means the collapse of the ocean kingdom was not a clean vertical drop. It was a breakdown in multiple stages and in multiple dimensions: chemical, climatic, biological, and regional. Some habitats may have remained more habitable than others for a time. Some lineages may have held on locally. Some parts of the food web may have faltered earlier than others, but that does not make the collapse less real. It makes it more realistic and therefore more dangerous. Complex systems often die by becoming unreliable first. The recovery story also tells us how deep the damage went. The 2025 Nature Communication study notes that several marine carbonate-producing groups did not fully recover until later in the Jurassic, nearly 2 million years after the extinction event. The 2022 review likewise frames the Triassic-Jurassic transition as part of a major shift that helped complete the transition from older Paleozoic-style marine communities toward more modern marine faunas. So the collapse did not simply remove a few spectacular animals and leave the rest of the marine world untouched. It reorganized the character of ocean life. That is what makes the phrase Lost Ocean Kingdom appropriate. The world after the boundary was not simply the old world minus a few whale-sized reptiles. It was a new marine order built from survivors, newcomers, altered chemistry, and slower recovery. The old arrangement had ended. Seen that way, the Somerset jaw becomes a border object between two Earths. On one side is the late Triassic marine system: giant ichthyosaurs, broad shelf seas, reptilian ocean rulers, and a food web still capable of supporting animals around 25 metres long. On the other side is the post-extinction world, in which ichthyosaurs persist but the giant Shastosaurid scale experiment has failed, marine chemistry has been badly disturbed, and recovery is slow and uneven. The jaw does not simply tell us an animal was big. It tells us exactly how much marine stability the world could support immediately before it could not. It is evidence of the highest level reached by that system near its end. The bigger the animal seems, the more serious the collapse has to be, because only a severe ecological breakdown can erase a strategy that had worked at such scale. So the ocean kingdom was lost in a very literal sense. It was dismantled by volcanism tied to the breakup of Pangaea, by carbon cycle disruption, by warming, by acidification, by oxygen crises in at least parts of the European seaway, and by extinction phases close enough together to leave marine reptiles less resilient than they looked. The giants at the top did not simply vanish because being giant was inherently foolish. They vanished because giant life depends on a very large amount of ecological cooperation from the rest of the planet, and that cooperation was withdrawn. Once that happens, even a lineage that reached blue whale length in reptile form can be reduced to fragments on a coast in Somerset, and the sea that once carried it can move on without ever rebuilding quite the same arrangement again. Which is what makes the final part of this story less about the violence of the ending and more about what remains after such a world is gone, because the giant disappears, the ocean changes, and what survives is the trace it left behind. In the end, almost everything about a giant animal disappears. The skin goes first, then the muscle, then the shape that once moved cleanly through water. The habits go, the sounds go, the exact colour goes. The ordinary routines of life go with them as well, which is perhaps the strangest part to think about. However large Ichthyotitan severnensis was, however powerful it may have seemed in the late Triassic Sea, it still had ordinary biological moments. It still had to move, feed, grow, turn, recover, and keep going in water that must once have felt as normal to it as air feels to us. And yet none of that remains in any direct way. What remains is harder, smaller, and quieter. A lower jawbone more than 2 metres long from Blue Anchor in Somerset, another giant matching jaw from nearby Lilstock, a formal scientific name published in 2024, and a body length estimate of around 25 metres, likely somewhere in a broader range of about 20 to 26 metres. That is the last echo we have, and even that comes to us in pieces. There is something very appropriate about that. A creature on this scale should perhaps be difficult to hold on to. It should not come down to us whole and cooperative. It should have to be rebuilt from fragments, from comparison, from one piece of jaw telling us that the animal attached to it was operating at a size the modern mind still tends to reserve for whales. The blue anchor surangula, found in 2020 by Justin and Ruby Reynolds, was more complete and better preserved than the earlier lilstock jaw, found in 2016 by Paul de la Salle, and together the two specimens allowed researchers to name Ichthyotitan severnensis, giant fish lizard of the Severn. The paper describes it as the first named giant Ratian ichthyosaur, and probably the largest marine reptile formerly described. It also notes that the histology of the blue anchor specimen suggests the individual was still growing. So the fossil is not only large, it hints that the giant we are trying to imagine may not even have been finished yet. That makes the title of this section useful in one sense and misleading in another. The 300-ton monster captures the scale people feel when they first hear the story. It is the kind of phrase that expresses the shock of the thing. But the safer scientific footing, at least right now, is length, not a precise weight. The 2024 paper gives a body length estimate around 25 metres and repeatedly emphasises that the material is fragmentary and that more complete remains are needed to confirm the giant size more securely. In other words, we're on very solid ground saying this animal may have rivaled a blue whale in length. We're on less solid ground pretending we already have an exact mass nailed down. That distinction matters because the fossil is interesting enough without borrowing confidence it does not yet possess. A whale-sized reptile from the latest Triassic is already a serious fact. It does not need extra decoration, and perhaps that is part of what makes the fossil so effective. It leaves just enough uncertainty to keep the animal alive in the imagination without turning it into fantasy. A complete skeleton can sometimes close a subject too neatly. It gives you the full outline, the mounted pose, the numbers on the wall, and the pleasant sense that the matter has been settled. Ichthyotitan does something more unsettling. It arrives as a jaw. It tells you that giant ichthyosaurs in the latest Triassic of the UK were real, that they had lower jaw bones over 2 meters long, that they belonged to a distinct new species, and that one of the known individuals was still growing. Then it stops. It does not tell you exactly how the whole head looked. It does not hand over every ecological detail. It does not confirm every last comparison people would like to make with blue whales. It leaves a gap between what is known and what is imaginable, and in that gap the animal remains more imposing than a fully explained specimen often would. There is another reason this fossil feels like an echo rather than just a discovery, and that is its timing. The Somerset jaws come from the latest Ratian, about 202 million years ago, just before the End-Triassic mass extinction. The 2024 paper states that the stratigraphic horizon immediately above the level of both finds represents a period of cataclysm, and argues that this lineage of giant ichthyosaurs probably vanished during the End-Triassic event. Later ichthyosaurs survived as a broader group, but, according to the same paper, they never again reached this size. So the jaw does not merely speak for a giant animal. It speaks for the closing stage of a whole marine way of life. It is not only the last echo of one monster, it is the last echo of a marine system that could still produce and sustain monsters at this scale. That system did not disappear quietly. The End-Triassic extinction is closely linked to massive volcanism from the Central Atlantic magmatic province, and reviews of the event describe a chain of climatic warming, ocean acidification, and widespread oxygen stress in marine environments. More recent work has sharpened those details. A 2025 study using boron isotopes from fossil oysters found direct evidence of ocean acidification, with a pH drop of at least 0.29 units associated with the crisis. Another study from the European epicontinental sea reported common water column anoxia across the Triassic-Jurassic transition, and more persistent euxinic conditions at a key phase of the extinction. In simple terms, the sea that had supported giant ichthyosaurs stopped being chemically and ecologically reliable. The food web beneath the giant was damaged from multiple directions at once. That is why the jaw feels like an echo. It comes from immediately before the room went empty. What makes the disappearance more striking is that giant ichthyosaurs had not been a brief novelty. They had been one of the major ways Triassic oceans expressed largeness. The 2024 paper places Ichthyotitan within a wider pattern of giant ichthyosaurs that include Symbospondylus youngorum around 15 to 17 metres, Shonisaurus popularis around 16 metres, and Shonisaurus sicaniensis around 21 metres. The Natural History Museum's coverage of the Somerset find says the new specimen hints these giants may have been even larger than previously thought. So when Ichthyotitan appears in the fossil record, it is not inventing marine gigantism in reptiles. It is standing very near the end of a long and successful experiment in it. The fact that this entire giant-bodied mode vanished near the end. Triassic boundary is one of the clearest signs that the environmental shift was not minor. The ocean did not simply lose a species, it lost the conditions that had allowed that scale of reptile to make sense. That loss is easy to state and harder to feel. The fossil record is good at compressing tragedy into a sentence. This lineage vanished. These forms never reached such size again. The extinction reduced disparity and diversity. All true, all concise. None of them capture the lived biological reality of what that means. A giant lineage does not vanish in the abstract. Real animals fail to find enough food. Reproduction stops matching mortality. Juveniles do not survive in the same numbers. Habitats shift out from under-established behaviours. Water chemistry begins imposing costs at lower levels of the ecosystem that eventually reach the top. The whole system starts becoming less predictable and less generous. By the time we notice that as extinction in the geological record, the living world has already been dealing with it as stress for a while. The Natural History Museum's more recent reporting even suggests that marine reptiles near the end of the Triassic may have been made more vulnerable by an earlier extinction event several million years before the final blow. So the last echo may have come from a world already weakened, even before the final break. There is also a smaller, more personal kind of echo in the way this story reaches us. A father and daughter are walking a beach in Somerset. An anonymous person has left one bone fragment on a boulder, perhaps assuming it looked important. Ruby Reynolds, 11 years old at the time, finds a larger and better preserved section nearby. The pieces are compared with an earlier giant specimen from Lilstock. Scientists, collectors and local finders work together. A species is named. A jaw that spent roughly 202 million years as a hidden fact in the coastline enters human language. That sequence matters because it reminds us that deep time is often recovered by attention rather than grandeur. We do not command the past to present itself. We notice what erosion allows us to see. A giant marine reptile the size of a blue whale does not return with thunder. It returns because someone bends down on a beach and realizes a piece of bone is not just a piece of bone. I think that is one reason this discovery lingers. It combines absurd scale with ordinary human circumstances. The animal itself belonged to a world almost impossible to picture in full. Late Triassic Britain was not Britain. Somerset was not Somerset. The sea lay across a different arrangement of land, under a different climate, with different chemistry, different coastlines, and different dominant vertebrates. Yet the fossil entered modern life in a completely familiar way. A beach walk, a find, a phone call, a comparison, a paper. It makes the distance between worlds feel both enormous and strangely manageable. 200 million years can separate us from the animal, and still one careful look at a weathered jaw can pull the story across that gulf. It also changes how one looks at the modern ocean. Blue whales are still the largest animals known to have lived, and the reason Ichthyotitan attracted so much attention is precisely because it may have reached that same general length class by a completely different evolutionary route. The Triassic giant was not a whale, not a mammal, and not a preview of later cetaceans. It was a marine reptile from a separate experiment in becoming huge. That matters because it tells us the sea has produced giants more than once, and under different rules each time. It also tells us those giants are temporary. The Triassic had its whale-sized reptiles. The modern world has its baleen whales. No marine giant, however successful, gets a permanent claim on the future. Once the supporting system changes far enough, the rulers of one age become the fossils of the next. For all that, the last echo is not only about loss, it is also about how much information a fragment can still carry. The blue anchor Sarangula preserves unusual morphology that matched the Lilstock specimen closely enough for researchers to erect a new genus and species. The histology preserved in the bone showed the animal was still growing. The size of the jaw gave a route to estimating the body length. The geological position of the find placed it immediately before one of the great turning points in marine history. From one jaw, a coastline, and a few related fragments, we can recover not just an animal but a whole argument about marine gigantism, extinction, and ecological dependence. That is a great deal for a fossil to manage. It is also why paleontology can feel so oddly intimate. The animal is gone, the sea is gone, the ecosystem is gone, but the bone still has enough to say that we can listen to it properly. And listening is really what this comes down to. Not in a mystical sense, in a practical one. The fossil record does not speak loudly. It gives hints, measurements, textures, mineral replacements, fractures, and histological structures. It gives localities and horizons. It gives one specimen that looks strange, and then another that matches it. It gives us a coastline where more may still remain buried in the rock. The Natural History Museum article on the Somerset discovery quotes Mark Jones saying the find hints these giants were possibly even larger than previously thought, and perhaps promises that more of the skeleton will be found in the future. That is a measured statement, but a very exciting one. It means the last echo may not be the only one. We may hear more yet. Another part of the skull. More of the jaw, postcranial bones, better evidence for body proportions, perhaps even enough material one day to reduce the gap between headline imagination and anatomical certainty. Until then, what we have is already enough to alter the shape of the past. It tells us that ancient oceans near the end of the Triassic still held marine reptiles that reached around 25 metres in length. It tells us that gigantism in marine reptiles persisted right up to the edge of the end Triassic crisis. It tells us that the giant ichthyosaur story did not fade out gradually into mediocrity, but was cut short by a major environmental collapse tied to volcanism, warming, acidification, and oxygen stress. It tells us that the biggest animals are often markers of the ecosystem beneath them, and that when those markers disappear, the loss is never only about size. It's about the breakdown of a whole structure that once made such size possible. So the last echo of the 300-ton monster, or perhaps more carefully the last echo of the whale-length monster, is not merely the fact that it was huge. It is the fact that it existed at all, in a world that no longer exists, and that one jaw on a Somerset shore is enough to prove the sea once ran on rules very different from our own. Long before modern whales, long before human beings, long before anyone would stand on that beach and call the place Blue Anchor, there was an animal moving through dark water on a scale that still forces us to pause. Then the world changed. The ocean chemistry changed. The food web changed. The giant line ended. What remains is a trace, a name, a measurement, and the stubborn physical fact of bone. And now, here we are again in the present, which is where all fossil stories eventually return us. A room somewhere, a late hour perhaps, a voice, a listener, and a coastline in the mind. When we began, this was a story about a monster that may have dwarfed the blue whale in reputation, if not securely in measured mass. By the end, it becomes something a little quieter, and, I think, more interesting. It becomes a story about how far evolution can go when the conditions are right, how suddenly those conditions can fail, and how one fragment from an ancient shore can carry an entire lost ocean inside it. That is not a bad thing to fall asleep with. Somewhere beneath the ordinary world, the older world is still there in pieces, waiting for someone patient enough to notice.